A common question that people ask regarding the Old Testament is that it's so filled with violence. And some people wonder, well, is violence ever justifiable? I think here it's helpful to make a few distinctions. For one thing, when we read in the Old Testament, God is never described as violent. Violence has to do with human, criminal activity, evil actions, and so forth. And so God, when he acts, it's not described as violent actions, but rather God is responding to violence. God is responding to human criminal activity and so forth. So it's important to keep that distinction in mind. Violence has to do with injustice. Violence has to do with that which God does not approve. And so that is something that we need to understand. But also, it's helpful to distinguish between violence and coercive force. You see, violence is indeed coercive force, but not all coercive force is violence. Of course, we think of Jesus driving money changers out of the temple. That is coercive force. When we look at warfare in the Old Testament, it is a very principled sort of a thing when God is commanding the Canaanites to be driven out by the Israelites. He sets out certain protocols, certain things that have to be done, certain practices that shouldn't be carried out. There was no, for example, no place for rape in warfare, as other ancient Near Eastern cultures did. The Israelites were prohibited from doing that and a number of other things. Things were very carefully prescribed for them that they shouldn't step over certain lines. When we look at the word violence, we need to understand that there are some things that may seem harsh to us, but they are driven by the justice of God, by God's concern that people are not mistreated, that people are not treated in an undignified way. And so as we look at these passages in the Old Testament that relate to harsh and severe actions, it's helpful to keep that violence and just coercive force distinction in mind. We distinguish that in for example, policing. There is such a thing as just policing. That there is a place for stopping perpetrators from doing their worst and using just coercive force in those cases. There is the question of just war. There is just war, and I do believe that there are certain just causes that require action to, for example, protect innocent civilians or innocent nations that are being attacked by a foreign nation, and that is just to protect them. That it would be wrong not to step in to help those who cannot protect themselves if we have the resources available to do that sort of a thing. So I believe that there is such a thing as just war. Now, some people might say, "Oh, that's violence." Well, again, if we want to make a proper distinction between violence and just war, I think it's important that we understand that violence is unprincipled. It is not pursuing justice. It is often to terrorize or to bring harm to people indiscriminately. And that is different from the proper use of just coercive force. And so when it comes to policing, when it comes to warfare against other nations, there is a place for protecting the innocent. And indeed, that's what the government is commissioned by God to do as we read the New Testament, that the government has a responsibility to preserve the peace, to punish the guilty, and to protect the innocent. And here's an example. The Apostle Paul in Acts 23, when his life is under threat by a mob, Paul is under Roman custody, and Paul says to this commander via his nephew that Paul's life is under threat. And so the commanding officer gives Paul a military escort of 470 persons, soldiers, who take Paul away from Jerusalem and to the coastal city of Caesarea in order to protect him. And this is what governments should do. When they're doing their God-given duty, they'll preserve the peace, they'll protect the innocent, they'll punish the guilty. So there is a place for justified coercive force that is morally appropriate, but violence is not, and God distances himself from that terminology in the Old Testament.